I'm Dean Bushmiller with Expanding Security, and this is Resiliency and Redundancy Principles and Practices. Use or consumption of this material by AI is expressly forbidden. Let's get started. I hear a lot of people saying to me, Dean, security and resiliency compete with each other, and we can't have that overlap, but we can. If we compare risk assessment, which is the security side of the house, and business impact assessment, which is the continuity side of the house, that's where we can break them apart, and then we can also compare them to each other. If we look at business continuity planning, they always say availability first, and then integrity and confidentiality second. For risk assessment, we don't say what's first. What we say is we have an appetite that determines which one of these things of confidentiality, integrity, and availability is first. The funny thing is that the likelihood is availability is first on that list. And I know what you're saying, but Dean, in our policy, it says that we do the best thing for confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and we label that third in the list. But what are the actions of the organization? And I will tell you that these two don't compete for most organizations that are out there, but I think that they can actually work together. I want to look at a tale of two recovery and resiliency processes that are out there. For me, in this case, and you can go to the Substack for free, and you can see the case where I talk about Netflix success and Southwest Airlines failure. When we look at Netflix for their success, they said, hey, regional loss for us is survivable. We can do it. And in 2015, they actually proved that where US East 1 disruption, where the entire US East 1 went out and everybody's watching Netflix. And what happened? There was a maximum of a 5-minute disruption. They called it a blip, but I will tell you, everybody got to watch their movies because they would have been complaining like crazy out there. What they did was they built a redundancy and resiliency practice around production failure experiments. They experimented on themselves. They basically said, oh, well, what happens when we turn off this core router? What happens when we turn off this core service? What happens when we're disconnected from our S3? And they used a tool that used to be Chaos Monkey, then it was Chaos Kong, and now it's retired at this point. But what it did is it went in and programmatically, randomly went into each one of the core components of their delivery mechanism and turned it off. It would be like you walking through a server room and flicking that thing off and flicking that thing off and shutting that thing off, and it should survive. Here's the problem though. Those chaos experiments require a couple of things. First off, observability, and very mature observability. You have to be able to look at your practice. You have to have good rollback discipline from previous updates to new updates. You have to understand what your blast radius are and what their limits are. And lastly, and this is the one that's the tough one, is the executives have to tolerate production risk. They have to understand it, and they have to know that when we take these steps and things fail, because we're doing these steps, things will succeed in the future when it really counts. Let's look at the other side of this thing. Southwest Airlines. In 2022, during the holiday season, by the way, in the holiday season, if you ever want to go ahead and really make the entire country mad, stop flights. And you know, this happens a lot in the United States where there'll be an argument in our governing bodies where they basically say, hey, we're not going to fund this thing, and it stops flights. And everybody goes, oh no, we can't do that because the American public will get really upset. Well, in this case, what happened is Southwest kind of blew it at that point. They had a disruption that exceeded their operational recovery capacity in many different ways. Flight crew operations, crew scheduling, customer service, and notifications all failed. You know, when I'm driving to the airport and somebody says to me, and I get a text message that says, your flight is delayed by 4 hours, I'll go back home. But I don't get any message, and I show up there, and now I have to eat crappy food for a really long time that's really expensive, and then they cancel my flight later on. Boy, now I'm really upset. And this is exactly what happened for Southwest Airlines in 2022. By the way, since then, this has subsequently happened to them and to other airlines. And so you can look at those studies. I picked these two because it was very clear about the successes and failures that they have. Let's look at some of these failures. First off, almost 17,000 flights were canceled. Just full stop. That means 2 million people were stranded. I don't know if you've ever been stranded in an airport, but I do not like it, and I get angry about it. And what do I get for it? Well, what Southwest got for it was $140 million in penalties. That wasn't just paybacks to people. That was $600 million in refunds that they had to do, but $140 million in, waggling the finger in the face and give us your money, and you don't get anything for it. The recovery issues kind of centered around crew scheduling. The way this works is a crew will stay with a plane as it's hopping across the country. But what happens if that particular plane and that particular crew is stranded there? Well, the next hop over, you go, okay, well, we've got a plane in stock. Let's roll that plane out here and call in another crew. Oh, there isn't one available. Wait a minute, why? Well, because they're on that plane over there and they haven't gotten here to fill this up. And so that cascaded over and over and over because the storm was so widespread. So what they did is they flipped over to their manual process. They said, okay, well, this isn't working for us. And this is what you do in good business continuity planning is you say, okay, our business continuity plan didn't work. What are the components of this where we can declare a disaster and then use those components to make things work for us? What's the manual process that we can go back to? What's the paper-based process that we can go back to so that we could get this done? And that did not work either because it was too slow to keep up with basically it looked like a rolling blackout for all the things that failed for them. So we've got two companies here, Netflix, which is a technical company and an entertainment company, and Southwest, which is a travel company. They're basically transporting people. And I know those are very different businesses, but we can take really good lessons from each one of those. And if you want to look at that case study in detail, that's in the Substack. You can look at it there and it goes through all those details and you can map that back to what processes do we have inside of our organization that could fail like this so we can build resiliency and redundancy for us. The next thing people are going to say, well, Dean, I have backups and backups prove recoverability. No, they don't. The reality is that backups prove that a copy exists. That's it. But when we restore, that proves that the service can recover. That's really what we want, is backups that are restored. Any kind of crisis out there will expose things like the missing dependencies, the missing credentials, the missing logs, and the data inconsistencies. And so it'll reveal it really quickly. This topic on resiliency and redundancy is a little bit more technical. I have another set of recordings out there on business continuity planning and disaster recovery. You should look at those. What we're doing inside of this section right here is we're verifying the technology requirements, but in order to have good technology requirements, resiliency and redundancy, you have to have the overall shape of business continuity and disaster recovery planning around that. So we're just going to dip a toe in here real quick. So what do we wrap around that technology? Well, business continuity plan and disaster recovery planning. So I'll point to a lot of those. And when you're looking through the whole presentation, when you see that ... it's like this is covered in that section over there. So what is BCP and DRP required? What do we need for our construction process? So we need, ultimately to preserve the mission essential outcomes. What do those things look like? Well, we say, what is the mission or service? For Netflix, it's entertaining us. It's, watching movies, that kind of thing. And now even games. So mission or service first. For Southwest, it's a different mission. Make sure you understand that mission. Okay, in that mission, what are our recovery objectives? That is a recovery time objective, which is the functional restore time. When should this be back up and running based upon the resiliency and redundancy principles and practices that we put in place? So that's a when, that's a time. There is also a recovery point objective where we can tolerate a data loss. When we talk about recovery point objectives, we're saying we have a transaction value, and that transaction value is assigned it's assigned a dollar amount, and we don't know how fast and furious or how slow those transactions are coming. So what we'll do is we'll build continuity efforts in place to make sure that when we lose this number of transactions, we would say, hey, that's unacceptable. So we'll put a control in place that'll protect us in that case up to this number of transactions. A lot of times this is like transaction journals and those kinds of things. But now, once we set those things in place, we have to validate those two objectives under realistic conditions. That's where Netflix, they just walked down the hall and just pulled the core router out and pulled this out and killed that switch and sent commands to the cloud to go ahead and turn off these operations there, and they wanted to watch it fail over. So we need good design. That design is going to be around technology outcomes, around people outcomes, supplier outcomes, communication outcomes. It's a lot of outcomes here. We want to see that these are the results on the other side. So we need lots of measures like recovery evidence. We need all of those things. Let's go back to business continuity planning and disaster recovery. In order to make this work, somebody's got to come up with money before it starts. You can't go, well, we really need insurance now that we've had a disaster. No, that's not going to work. You have to provide for upfront. So we have to define the funding, okay? And we do that beforehand for what is our protected function? How much money are we going to spend on that? Our failure mode, how much are we going to spend on that? Our switchover methodology, how are we going to spend on that? How much are we going to spend? And then the thing that everybody just lets go of is the test interval. The beautiful thing about Netflix Chaos Kong was you didn't know when it was going to wake up and start throwing poop all over the cage. And they had to be ready for it at all times. The other thing is people say, hey, high availability eliminates disruptions. If I've got high availability in place, everything will be just fine. No, because see, there could be residual failures on this. Like in the case of a lot of deployments, there could be a bad deployment and we don't know about it in our CI/CD, our pipeline there. We could have data corruptions that we don't know about, identity outages, and this is the one that's causing a lot of problems these days. I've known for a lot of organizations, they say, hey, we've got multi-factor authentication, and one of those things is a token that we present and authenticate to the service. That's fine when you've got a keyboard and a place to plug in that token here, or, like for me, I've got fingerprint ID right here. But what about the server? See, in identity outages, you want to go to authenticate to that server, but the thing that you use to get into that server, to get the permissions, to make the changes, that's down also. We've got to have a backup way to deal with that. Supplier disruptions. In the case of manufacturing, supplier disruptions are a really big deal. Sometimes we could say, well, the supplier is the person, and then we would also separate that from human error. People are going to mess things up. What I look for when I'm dealing with resiliency and redundancy is common cause failures, the things that blow things up for everybody. Because these redundant elements may fail together. The shared causes are things like power, identity, software defects, supplier, data corruption, and network route is also another big one in there, especially when we're failing over and we've got load balancers involved. So what do we do about it? What's the solution to this problem? Well, we do good design where we look at separation of these things, diversity among these products, so we can authenticate in multiple ways and correlate failure exercises across the entire thing to say, hey, you know what? This thing didn't work and this thing did work. By the way, this is a really good time to kind of bring AI in and say, hey, look at what we've got here and tell me where to test for failure, because it may see things that we can't see. A lot of people will say redundancy equals resiliency. It does not. They are two entirely different things. And let's break them down. Resiliency, one strong system with the ability to anticipate, withstand, and adapt. The system, remember, this system could be more than just some technical parts inside of there. The adverse conditions are defined by our threat modeling that we create. This could be, for example, cyber threat incidents, infrastructure failures, supplier disruption, weather, in the case of Southwest, data corruption, staffing limits, in the case of Southwest, and human error. They're all possible here, and in our threat modeling, we have to look for those things. That's resiliency, one strong one. Redundancy is many small systems. That would be a lot of duplication. And here's the key, with communication. And we have a lot of duplication, but we don't have a lot of duplication with communication. And that's the piece that makes the redundancy work well. The elements are things like capacity, components, data, paths, the different ways to get there, facilities, and support. When we look at redundancy, the risks that we talk about here are the increased complexity. If we've got one big, strong one, then we're okay, right? No, we got a lot of little ones out there, and the complexity of them communicating can cause problems. Also, if we have any standby assets where we do an active-passive setup, which I do for my organization, for my learning management system, I have standby assets sitting there. It could be that the data that gets replicated to those assets is stale. How long of a period of time do we have before the next replication? And we have to set up in our contracts and communicate to those people in our organization. We have to say, oh, if you're a customer of mine, like for instance, if you're a customer of mine at Expanding Security, what you need to know is that we have the right in our contract with you to fail over, and you could lose your last most recent quiz. That's not a big deal when it comes to learning that you would retake a quiz. You can't really do that with planes or an event that you're creating. So the risk we're looking for is common cause failure when we're talking about redundancy. Resiliency and redundancy and fault tolerance, we want to kind of mix all of that stuff together. The way we do that is through a technical design behavior. We look for items like fail safe, degrade gracefully. We want to look at the utilization across particular assets that are there and measure that on a long period of time. Rolling back to a previous set, this works really well with cloud, and we're doing lots of blue-green deployments. Reconfiguration, the ability to reconfigure. When our business continuity methodologies fail, we can't say it didn't work, we can never do it again, or we're just, we're out of business at this point. We have to say, what is that thing over there, and can we reuse that in this case? Can we fail over to our second or third or fourth location? How do we switch to standby? That's a technical design behavior. And also, how do we stop cascading failures, the harm before it actually spreads? What lessons can we learn from others in resiliency and redundancy? Let's start off with an example of ransomware. Well, the ransomware lessons that we've learned is one replica can synchronize bad data. So if an adversary can get into our data and they can corrupt our data and we've got really good replication, we're just replicating garbage. Our actions for ransomware should be things like separating the backup identity, using immutable recovery points. That means that the data that we have there, that it's a write once, read many. Use offline recovery points. Monitor any kind of replication lag. That's a big one that we're looking for, especially when we're doing transactions. And test clean environment restoration. See that it actually works. Start from zero and see what happens. The big lesson that I learned in a lot of my recovery efforts and business continuity planning that I work with my customers is humans are the most resilient component in this, but they can also be the one that fails the worst. So what we want to do is we want to test. Like for instance, for Southwest, they had a problem with a surge in staffing or a lack of staffing. They needed a lot of people in this location and they couldn't get them there because, they fly on planes to get there. Whose incident role? How do we deal with things? Who are the boots on the ground? Who is the person that is making the incident work? In the case of Southwest, they were actually pretty smart about this. The agents, the ticket agents that were on the front end were working with the staff and they weren't trying to figure out where the plane was. They had people behind the scenes that were actually trying to figure out where the planes are, how could they redirect them, how could they take planes out of storage and actually use them, where could they get their flight crews from. So in those cases, the incident roles They knew how to separate those things out. Most of the time when you look at that flight gate person, that agent at the gate, they're doing two things at once. They're checking passengers in, talking to passengers, doing customer service, but they're also going, hey, can this plane make it on this, can this bag make it on this plane right now? How do we communicate? There's another problem. If the gate agent gets up there and goes, I don't care what you think, everybody's going to be mad. They're going to go away. They're going to want a refund. We have to make the messaging work. In the case of flights, one of the things that I want status updates on my phone if I'm going to show up at the airport. We have to have good manual workarounds for those people. We have to have a sheet that pulls out. We do this in Southwest. We do this with pilots across everything. They have a physical checklist that they work through. Every single pilot works through that, and the co-pilot works through that to test all of the instrumentation inside of the plane. But this was on the outside of the plane. This wasn't the plane being the problem. They had plenty of planes. They were in the wrong place. The staff was in the wrong place, and the systems couldn't redirect. In all of these things, the people that are a part of this have a requirement of proof. They say, I want to see that this works. The next time that I fly Southwest, I want to make sure that this system updates me correctly, and I want to see that that's in working order. There's a lot of accountability pressure out here. That's going to be consumer protection issues that happen with Southwest, sector regulators that are out there. And if there's a breach of contract, we want a return on that for large entities. What we should do is we should tie claims to things like verifiable measures so that management knows that this is going to get done, any kind of exercises, metrics, and good lessons learned from previous. Since 2022, Southwest has done a really good job of reacting to this, and they've done it very well. When you're looking at resiliency and redundancy principles and practice for you, look at those case studies and see whether your organization is ready to run and can handle it. Where does AI fit into all this? Oh, by the way, if you go onto my Substack, one of the things that you can see is a quiz on resiliency and redundancy. You can copy and paste that quiz into your favorite AI. It is a prompt that will quiz you. You can pick it up and you can copy it into your favorite AI, and it will actually give you a quiz on whether you understand resiliency and redundancy beyond what we're talking about here. Are you ready to perform in your environment? But let's look at AI and how it supports us in resiliency and redundancy. It changes business continuity planning controls. It really does. What we can do that we couldn't do before was AI dependency mapping. Not the AI dependency, but the business continuity dependency mapping, and figure out where are the hidden service dependencies that we didn't understand were there. Where are the single points of failure? Where are fragile vendors that are inside of this? When I call up my vendors and say, hey, I need you to deploy these services at this location, and I'm not talking about virtual services, I'm talking about like physical infrastructure. Sometimes it's fences to go ahead and protect my assets. Sometimes it's generators. Sometimes it's computers. I need to be able to call that vendor and say, I'm declaring emergency. Can you deploy these things for me? And we also need to be able to do that in our testing process. We're looking for upstream data risks. And that's what AI is good at. It's looking at these dependencies and it's mapping out these dependencies that we actually couldn't see. Could it assist us in our capabilities? Yes, it can. Runbooks are really hard to generate correctly. Once we've got the process for them and we tweak this thing over here, it changes the runbooks for all of these people over here and on all those digital assets. So AI can help us with that. It can help us with summarizing the incidents, recommending the recovery steps, giving us some hints, because sometimes in the middle, and I don't know how many continuity issues you've had, but in the middle of the moment at that time, sometimes I seize up a little bit. I panic just a little tiny bit. And that can kickstart me and move me forward. It can also automate triage. I've said all these things, but let's have a big fat pause right here. AI generates these things. It's your responsibility to test every component created by AI, not trust that it did it correctly. Because The same thing happens before AI. When we generated these playbooks, does that playbook say the thing that it's supposed to say, and does it say it correctly for this situation, this level of training, this person, at this location, at this time? We don't know all of those things, but we can test most of those things beforehand. So I hope you'll join me for the entire presentation.